March 1945. A historic cobblestone town square in Trier, Germany. Exhausted American soldiers lean against mud-splattered vehicles, breathing in the cold air of a shattered continent. The high-pitched whine of heavy diesel machinery echoes between medieval stone walls as a column of 30-ton Sherman tanks rumbles into the center of the ancient plaza to establish a defensive perimeter. Suddenly, a door slams open at the municipal hall. A man in an immaculate woolen coat storms directly toward the lead war machine, waving a white sheet of paper and shouting over the roar of the engines. He bypasses armed sentries to scream at a bone-weary tank commander, demanding immediate compensation for the scratches and chips left on the 300-year-old cobblestones by the heavy steel treads. General Patton will answer this bureaucratic outrage by turning those historic stones into a permanent, pulverizing lesson in total defeat. This is the story of what Patton did when a German official complained about tank tread damage. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities. Staff Sergeant Joe Rusty Barnes was 24 years old. He came from Detroit, Michigan, where he had worked on a Ford assembly line before the draft board called his name. He served with the 4th Armored Division, a unit that had clawed its way through the mud of France and the freezing snow of the Ardennes. 2 days ago, a teenage boy hiding in a cellar with a Panzerfaust had fired a rocket directly into the turret of Joe's tank. The blast killed his bow gunner instantly, leaving Joe to wipe his friend's blood from the control panel before resuming the advance. Joe had not slept in 48 hours. His teeth clattered from the biting wind, and his hands were permanently blackened by diesel grease and cordite. He sat in the commander's hatch of his idling Sherman, staring blankly at the ruined buildings around him. He was a young man who had forgotten the sound of silence. Burgermeister Wilhelm Klaus was 60 years old. He had served as the local mayor of Trier for nearly a decade, maintaining order under a regime he viewed as a necessary guardian of traditional Germanic culture. Klaus believed that war was a professional enterprise that should be conducted politely between gentlemen, completely separate from the administration of civic property. He stepped into the square wearing a pristine woolen overcoat, a pressed felt fedora, and polished leather boots that had never touched the mud of a frontline trench. Klaus held a wooden clipboard tightly against his chest, viewed the American soldiers as uncultured invaders, and possessed a family lineage that had inhabited the valley since the 17th century. He looked at the heavy steel tracks of the American armor and saw an intolerable insult to his civic authority. He marched directly toward the lead vehicle to halt the desecration of his town. By March 1945, the Western Front was moving at a ferocious, punishing speed. Allied forces had smashed through the outer defenses of the German border, crossing the Saar River and driving deep into the Rhineland. The Third Reich was collapsing into chaos as frontline units dissolved, communication lines snapped, and local officials were left to face the advancing armies alone. In the wake of this rapid collapse, thousands of ancient towns and villages became sudden, chaotic zones of occupation. American units under General Patton's command were moving too quickly to establish complex administrative bureaucracies in every captured municipality. Military governors were stretched thin, leaving combat commanders on the ground to handle civilian populations, while simultaneously scanning the tree lines for enemy ambushes. In this environment of total collapse, many American officers had taken a lenient approach toward local authorities. They allowed town leaders to maintain basic services, manage food distribution, and handle minor disputes without interference, preferring to keep the peace while the main column pushed eastward. Some commanders had even signed receipts for requisitioned fuel, civilian buildings, or minor property damage, simply to keep the advance moving smoothly, without civilian rippling. This practical leniency had created a false sense of security among remaining German bureaucrats, who mistakenly believed that the rules of peacetime governance still applied to an occupying army that was bleeding across Europe. They did not understand that the incoming combat troops had spent months watching their friends die in the mud. The old administrative world was dead, but the men inside the town halls had not yet smelled the smoke. The heavy iron treads of the American Shermans continued to grind into the plaza as the mayor stepped off the curb. Burgermeister Klaus stepped off the stone curb and marched directly toward the idling tank. Shaking his wooden clipboard at the young commander, he shouted up at the hatch, his voice rising above the low vibration of the engine. "You must stop these machines immediately." Joe Barnes did not move. He blinked through the layer of engine grease on his face, his gloved hands resting loosely on the rim of the hatch. He looked at the older man's clean woolen coat, then back down at his own stained sleeve. "Shut the engine down," the mayor shouted, stamping his polished leather boot on the ground. "You are destroying municipal property." Joe slowly reached down and switched off the intercom, then looked down at the street. The heavy steel tracks had scraped long white lines across the dark stones. He looked back at the mayor. "We are securing the intersection, mister." "This is not a mere intersection," Klaus said, his voice trembling with indignation. "This is the historic market square of Trier. These cobblestones were laid 300 years ago by the finest craftsmen in the Rhineland. Your heavy iron vehicles are cracking them into pieces." "We have orders to hold the perimeter," Joe answered. The engine stayed at a low rumble. "Your orders do not give you the right to vandalize an ancient European city," Klaus said, holding up his clipboard to display a neatly typed sheet of paper. "I am the mayor of this town. I demand that you sign this official damage report. Your government will pay for the restoration of this square." Joe leaned forward, his voice completely flat. "My Bewohner died 48 hours ago." The mayor waved his hand impatiently, brushing the statement aside. "That is a matter for the military registries. I am talking about the historic preservation of German culture. You Americans have no appreciation for antiquity. You arrive with your industrial filth and crush 3 centuries of civilization beneath your treads. Sign this paper." Joe didn't move his hand toward the clipboard. He just stared at the white sheet. "I am not signing anything," Joe said. "Then I will speak to your superior officer," Klaus snapped, turning his back on the tank to look for a man with higher rank. "You undisciplined factory workers cannot simply ruin our heritage without consequence. This war must be conducted with respect for proper administrative authority." An American captain from the infantry company nearby walked over, his rifle slung over his shoulder, having noticed the disturbance. He looked at the mayor's crisp uniform coat, then at Joe's hollow eyes. He immediately realized the situation was escalating far beyond a standard civilian dispute. The captain told the mayor to step back, but Klaus refused to lower the clipboard, demanding an audience with someone who could authorize a signature for the destruction of the historic stone market. Recognizing the volatile nature of the confrontation in a newly captured zone, the captain immediately sent a radio message back to the tactical command post. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's command jeep pulled up to the center of the market square within the hour. The vehicle stopped sharply against the stone curb, its tires kicking up dry gray dust. 4 polished silver stars glinted in the winter sun on the front bumper and on his helmet. 2 ivory-handled revolvers rested inside leather holsters at his hips. The general sat perfectly straight, his uniform pressed, his eyes scanning the gathering crowd of soldiers and civilians. The noisy chatter of the square dropped to an immediate heavy silence as he stepped out onto the stones. He walked directly toward the front of the Sherman tank, where the mayor was still clutching his wooden clipboard. Patton studied the older man for a quiet moment. He did not raise his voice. "Are you the administrator responsible for this municipality?" Patton asked. "I am the mayor of Trier," Klaus answered, stepping forward and adjusting his fedora. "I am trying to prevent the lawless destruction of our historic public spaces." "Did you present this paper to my tank commander?" Patton asked. "I did," Klaus said, holding out the clipboard. "It is an official billing invoice for severe property damage. Your heavy steel combat vehicles are ruining our 300-year-old cobblestones." Patton looked down at the white sheet of paper, then up at the mayor. "You are deeply concerned about the condition of these stones. They are irreplaceable monuments of German culture, Klaus said, his voice regaining its bureaucratic confidence. We expect your army to respect municipal law and pay for the labor to restore them. Patton looked past the mayor, pointing a gloved finger at the grease-stained, blood-weary soldiers leaning against the hull of the Sherman. He looked back at the clean woolen coat of the local administrator. Your country spent 5 years launching thousands of tons of steel across the borders of independent nations, Patton said. You pulverized the ancient brick of Rotterdam. You turned the historic stone squares of London into smoking craters of ash and broken bone. Your armies tore through the cities of your neighbors, without a single thought for their centuries of culture or the preservation of their heritage. Now, the full weight of that industrial war has returned to your own doorstep. The general stepped closer, his voice cold and steady. You stood by silently while your regime smashed the face of Europe into fine dust. You did not issue invoices when your machines were crushing the homes of innocent people. You did not complain about property damage until the treads of an army you could not stop arrived outside your own office window. You are worried about your stones. We are worried about ending your war. You have a choice. You can stand here and watch us secure this intersection, or you can watch exactly what happens when your old hierarchies meet our new realities. The mayor looked at the cold steel of the ivory revolvers, then down at his typed paper. He remained frozen, his mouth half open, completely unable to find a response. Patton turned toward the idling Sherman tank and looked up at Staff Sergeant Joe Barnes. He gave a sharp, definitive nod. Patton ordered the young sergeant to put his 30-ton war machine into neutral gear and execute a full pivot steer right in the absolute center of the market square. Joe pulled the steering levers back. The diesel engine let out a deafening, metallic scream as the tank surged with sudden power. The heavy steel tracks began to spin rapidly in opposite directions, turning the massive vehicle on its own central axis. The jagged metal grouser cleats bit deeply into the 300-year-old cobblestones, fracturing the smooth granite blocks with a series of loud, explosive cracks. The mayor watched in absolute horror as the ancient craftsman stones were violently chewed and ground into a fine, blinding white powder. A thick cloud of chalky dust billowed up from the spinning tracks, settling heavily over the mayor's pristine woolen overcoat and blanketing his polished leather boots in gray soot. Nearby infantrymen watched the display with grim satisfaction, while local civilians quickly backed away into the shadowed doorways. The tank finally ground to a halt, leaving a deep, pulverized crater in the middle of the plaza. Patton looked at the white dust covering the mayor, then turned back to his jeep. Cedes the bill to Berlin. Staff Sergeant Joe Barnes returned home to Detroit, Michigan. Shortly after the cessation of hostilities, he went back to the Ford Motor Plant, resuming his position on the noisy assembly line. Though his family noted he rarely spoke about his years in the armored division, he spent his remaining decades living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, tending to a small garden, and completely avoiding any public gatherings that featured loud, sudden noises. Joe died peacefully in the summer of 1983, leaving behind his old silver dog tags and a single, faded photograph of his crew taken before the crossing of the Saar River. Burgomaster Wilhelm Klaus was officially removed from his administrative post during the Allied denazification process later that autumn. He spent several months in a civilian internment camp before being released to return to his family home in the Moselle Valley. He spent his final years living in bitter isolation, frequently writing long, ignored letters to the regional judicial courts demanding personal restitution for the destruction of municipal landmarks. Klaus passed away in the winter of 1961, still carrying the conviction that the American military had behaved like uncultured vandals in the historic province. General Patton never recorded the minor confrontation in his personal diary, nor did he mention the ruined square of Trier in his official reports to the Supreme Command. He viewed the incident as a brief, necessary alignment of a local bureaucrat's priorities with the immediate demands of a moving army. He noted to a staff officer that afternoon that some people had to be shocked into realizing their empire was entirely gone. Some historians have argued that Patton's destructive action in the town plaza was a gratuitous, heavy-handed display of military power that unnecessarily ruined a surviving piece of European heritage. They claim that the local administrative official was simply acting within his civic duty to preserve his municipality from careless ruin after years of total mobilization. Others have argued the exact opposite, maintaining that the physical demonstration was a necessary and brilliant psychological act designed to shock an arrogant population into realizing the absolute reality of their total defeat. What is certain is that the fractured crater in the center of the market square remained visible for decades, serving as a permanent monument to the exact moment the war truly ended for the people of Trier. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have signed the official property damage clipboard? Or would you have quietly moved your heavy armor to another intersection to preserve the ancient market square? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about what happened when old hierarchies met new realities, make sure to subscribe.